October 14th, 1943. The Eastern Front stretched like a wound across Europe, bleeding men and machines into the frozen earth. In a bombed-out factory on the outskirts of Stalingrad, a young Soviet soldier named Dmitry Volkov crouched behind twisted steel beams, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air. His hands, numb from cold and fear, gripped something that shouldn't have existed. It was a rifle, yes, but not like any the Red Army had issued. Welded to the barrel was a contraption of salvaged glass, bent metal and wire. It looked like the work of a madman or a desperate fool. His fellow soldiers had laughed when they first saw it. "Volkov's telescope," they called it, snickering behind their hands. "He thinks he's hunting deer in the Urals." But Dmitry wasn't hunting deer. Through the cracked lens of his improvised scope, he could see something that made his heart pound against his ribs. A German Panzer IV, its grey hull cutting through the morning mist like a steel shark. It was moving along the distant ridge, nearly 2,000 metres away, far beyond the range of any normal rifle, far beyond what any sane man would attempt. The tank crew inside had no idea they were being watched. To them, this was just another patrol through conquered territory, another day of rolling through the ruins of Soviet resistance. They didn't know that below the rub, a 22-year-old optical apprentice from Moscow was calculating wind speed, elevation, and the mathematics impossible of a shot that would either make him a legend or get him killed trying. Dmitry had never been meant for war. Before the Germans came, he worked in a small optical repair shop near Red Square, fixing spectacles for professors and camera lenses for photographers. His world was measured in millimetres and focal lengths, not bullets and blood, but war doesn't ask what you were meant for. It takes what it needs and leaves the rest to burn. The mockery had started weeks earlier when Dmitry first presented his creation to UNIT. His were in a long-dug defensive line that existed more paper than in reality. The Germans held onto the high ground, the roads and most of the working equipment. What the Soviets had were numbers, desperation, and soldiers like Dmitry who refused to accept that impossible meant impossible. He had scavenged the components over days of careful searching. The lens came from a destroyed German reconnaissance vehicle, cracked but still functional. The mounting hardware was fashioned from pieces of a ruined anti-aircraft gun. The adjustment mechanisms were built from salvaged tank parts, filed and shaped by hand in the dark hours before dawn. It wasn't pretty, but it was precise. At least, Dmitry hoped it was. His commanding officer, a grizzled sergeant named Petrov, who had survived the purges and the first year of the German invasion, had examined the device with the skepticism of a man who had seen too many young soldiers die from confidence. "What over is this thing supposed to do?" he asked, turning the rifle over in his weathered hands. "It's a telescopic sight, Comrade Sergeant, for long-range shooting." Dmitry's voice carried the quiet conviction of someone who understood optics better than most people understood breathing. Petrov squinted through the improvised scope, then handed it back with a grunt. "The Germans are 300 meters away, not 3,000. Save your fairy tales for after the war, if you live that long." But the other soldiers were less diplomatic. "Look at the professor one," muttered. "Building toys while we dig graves." Another laughed, a harsh sound without humour. "Maybe he thinks the Germans will surrender when they see his invention at the science fair." The ridicule stung, but not as much as watching German tanks roll through Soviet positions with impunity. Every day, Panzer columns moved along the distant roads, untouchable, unstoppable. The Red Army had anti-tank rifles, but they were heavy, unwieldy weapons that required crews to get dangerously close to their targets. What they needed was something different. Something that could reach out across the battlefield and touch the enemy where they felt safe. Dmitry had grown up listening to his grandfather's stories about the old Imperial Army, about Cossack sharpshooters who could put a bullet through a playing card at impossible distances. Those men didn't have telescopic sights or precision rifles. They had eyes like eagles and hands steady as stone. But they also had something else: the refusal to accept that any target was out of reach. The German war machine was built on the assumption of technological superiority. Their optics were manufactured in precision factories by skilled craftsmen. Their rifles were engineered to tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. Their scopes were tested and calibrated by experts who had spent years perfecting their art. What they hadn't planned for was a half-trained optical apprentice with a handful of salvaged parts and nothing left to lose. Dmitri's scope was a violation of every principle of proper optical engineering. The lenses weren't perfectly aligned, the mounting system flexed under recoil, the adjustment mechanisms had been filed by hand in conditions that would make a Swiss watchmaker weep. By every rational measure, it should have been useless. But rational measures didn't account for the desperate ingenuity of a man watching his homeland burn. He had tested it in secret during the long nights when the front was quiet. Using a captured German rifle with better ballistics than his standard-issue Mosin Nagant, he had practiced on distant targets. A burned-out truck at 800 meters, a piece of debris at 1200. Each shot taught him something new about his improvised scope, about its quirks and limitations. He learned to compensate for the slight distortion in the salvage lens. He memorized the exact amount of adjustment needed for different ranges. He practiced until the rifle became an extension of his hands and the scope an extension of his eyes. The other soldiers continued to mock him, but their laughter had an edge of nervousness now. They had all seen him shooting, seen the impossible accuracy he achieved with his cobbled-together equipment. It was easier to dismiss it as luck than to admit that perhaps the young man with quiet, the steady hands had created something remarkable from the wreckage of war. The German Panzer on the ridge represented everything Dmitri had been working toward. It was a target that conventional wisdom said couldn't be engaged at this range. The tank was nearly 2 kilometers away, moving slowly but steadily along a predictable path. The crew inside felt secure in their steel cocoon, protected by distance and armor from the desperate Soviet infantry huddled in the ruins below. But distance was an illusion and armor was only as strong as the weakest point. Dmitri knew from his study of captured German vehicles that even the mighty Panzer IV had vulnerabilities. The vision ports, the commander where armor's cupola, the joint plates met. These were tiny targets, but they were targets nonetheless. And with his improvised scope, tiny targets became possible. The wind was steady from the northwest, carrying the smell of cordite and burning fuel across the battlefield. Dmitri calculated the correction needed, adjusting his aim point to account for the bullet's long journey through the cold morning air. At this range, even small errors would be magnified into complete misses. The mathematics of ballistics became a prayer spoken in the language of physics and hope. His finger found the trigger, cold metal against cold skin. Through the cracked lens of his makeshift scope, the German tank filled his vision like a steel mountain. Somewhere inside that machine were men who had never heard his name, who would never know what hit them. The war had reduced everything to this moment, this calculation, this impossible shot that would either prove his genius or confirm his folly. The morning air was still, the kind of perfect calm that every marksman dreams of and rarely finds. Dmitri's breathing slowed to match the rhythm of his heartbeat. In the optical shop back in Moscow, his master had taught him that precision was not about force, but about patience. The eye sees what the mind expects, the old man had said while adjusting a microscope lens. But the true craftsman sees what is actually there. Through his improvised scope, the Panzer IV crawled along the ridge like a mechanical beetle. Its commander's cupola was visible, a small protrusion that represented the tank's brain. Dmitri knew that inside that steel box, a German officer was scanning the horizon through his own optics, confident in his superiority, unaware that he was being watched by eyes 2 kilometers away. The rifle in Dmitri's hands was not the weapon he had trained with. Standard Soviet doctrine called for massed fire, for overwhelming the enemy with volume rather than precision. The Mosin Nagant was a tool of the infantry, designed to be manufactured quickly and used by conscripts who might have days rather than years of training. But this rifle was different. Captured from a German sniper weeks earlier, it carried the precision engineering that the Reich demanded of its finest weapons. Dmitri had spent hours studying the weapon, learning its quirks and characteristics. The bolt action was smooth as silk compared to his issued rifle. The barrel was manufactured to tolerances that Soviet factories could barely imagine. Most importantly, it was designed to work with optical sights, something the German military had understood long before their Soviet counterparts. The marriage between this precision rifle and his improvised scope should have been a disaster. German engineering, optical, Soviet feel, and improvisation were philosophies separated by an ocean of technical sophistication. Yet somehow, in the crucible of desperate need, they had found harmony. The crude mounting system held the salvage lens steady enough for accurate fire. The hand-filed adjustment mechanisms provided the precise corrections needed for extreme range shooting. His fellow soldiers watched from their positions along the defensive line, some openly skeptical, others quietly curious. Word had spread through the unit about Volkov's impossible project. Even soldiers from neighbouring companies had heard rumours about the optical apprentice who claimed he could kill tanks with a rifle. The story had grown in the telling, as stories do in wartime, until he had built a magic weapon that could see through walls and shoot around corners. Senior Lieutenant Kozlov, the unit's political officer, had initially viewed Dmitri's activities with suspicion. Innovation without authorization was dangerous in the Red Army, where deviation from doctrine could be interpreted as sabotage or worse. But the desperate situation on the Eastern Front had created a strange tolerance for unconventional solutions. As long as Dmitri's experiments didn't interfere with his duties, Kozlov was content to let the young man pursue his optical obsession. The German tank continued its methodical patrol, unaware that it had become the subject of the most ambitious shot ever attempted by a Soviet infantryman. Inside the Panzer, the crew performed their routine checks and observations. The driver maintained steady speed over the rough terrain. The gunner scanned for targets through his own optical sight. The commander studied maps and coordinated with other units through his radio. They represented the pinnacle of German military technology and training. The tank itself was a masterpiece of engineering, its armour carefully sloped to deflect incoming rounds, its gun capable of destroying any Soviet tank at normal combat ranges. The crew had trained for months to operate as a single organism, each man's skills complementing those of his comrades. They were professionals in a war increasingly dominated by desperate amateurs. But professionalism could not protect them from the unexpected. German doctrine assumed that infantry anti-tank weapons had limited range and effectiveness. Their tactical manuals specified safe distances for different types of threats. At 2 kilometers, they were theoretically beyond the reach of any man-portable weapon in the Soviet arsenal. They had no reason to expect danger from such an impossible distance. Dmitri understood this psychology because he had studied captured German training materials. The enemy's confidence was both their strength and their weakness. They trusted their equipment, their training, their technological superiority. They did not expect to face weapons that shouldn't exist, created by methods that violated every principle of proper military engineering. The mathematics of the shot were complex beyond anything taught in Soviet military schools. At 2,000 meters, a bullet would travel for nearly 3 seconds, enough time for wind to push it meters off course. The projectile would arc high into the sky before beginning its descent toward the target, following a parabolic path that required precise calculation of elevation and age corrections. D-win. Dmitri had taught himself these calculations through trial and error, using mathematics learned in technical school and refined through desperate experimentation. He estimated wind speed by watching the movement of smoke from distant fires. He calculated bullet drop by observing the trajectory of artillery rounds. He learned to read the subtle signs that revealed atmospheric conditions across the battlefield. His improvised scope magnified the target, but it also magnified every tremor of his hands, every irregularity in his breathing. The salvage lens created slight distortions that he had learned to compensate for through practice. The mounting system flexed under recoil, requiring him to re-zero the scope after every few shots. These were not the problems faced by German snipers with their factory-manufactured equipment, but they were problems that could be solved through patience and skill. The trigger beneath his finger was cold as winter steel, smooth from years of use by its previous owner. German precision engineering had created a mechanism that broke cleanly and consistently without the creep and uncertainty of mass-produced weapons. It was a tool worthy of the impossible shot he was attempting, even if the man pulling was not the soldier for whom it had been designed. Around him, the morning battlefield held its breath. The distant rumble of artillery had faded to silence. The ever-even-present sound of small arms fire had diminished to sporadic cracks echoing across the frozen landscape. It was as if the war itself had paused to witness this moment of perfect possibility. This intersection of desperation and skill that would either write a legend or claim another forgotten casualty. The German tank rolled forward, steady and predictable, its crew unaware that their routine patrol had become the target of the most audacious shot in the history of the Eastern Front. The Panzer's commander swept his binoculars across the desolate landscape, scanning for movement among the ruins. From his position in the cupola, the world looked conquered, pacified. The scattered Soviet positions appeared broken, their defenders huddled in whatever shelter they could find. This was routine now, another patrol through territory that belonged to the Reich. He couldn't know that his every movement was being tracked through a lens that shouldn't have worked by a man who shouldn't have been able to see him. Dmitri adjusted his breathing, feeling the cold air burn his lungs as he settled into the perfect rhythm his grandfather had taught him during hunting trips in the Urals. 3 heartbeats between breaths. Hold on the second. Fire on the pause. The salvaged German lens brought the tank into sharp focus, despite its imperfections. Through the cracked glass, Dmitri could see individual details that should have been invisible at this range. The mud caked on the tank's road wheels, the radio antenna swaying slightly in the morning breeze. Most importantly, the narrow vision slit where the commander's face occasionally appeared as he scanned the horizon. His calculations raced through his mind like equations on a blackboard. Wind speed, approximately 8 kilometers per hour from the northwest. Temperature, minus 12 degrees Celsius. Barometric pressure, falling slightly. Range, 1,940 meters by his estimation. Each variable would affect the bullet's flight path, turning a straight line into a complex arc that defied intuition. The German rifle in his hands had been crafted by artisans who understood the precision of art. Every A formed to specifications that Soviet component was manufacture factories could barely comprehend. The barrel had been hammer-forged and hand-lapped until its bore was smoished marble, other than pole. The action cycled with mechanical perfection, each part fitted to tolerances measured in hundredths of millimeters. But precision meant nothing without the skill to use it. Dmitri had spent countless hours learning this weapon's personality, understanding how it responded to temperature changes, how the barrel harmonics affected accuracy, how the trigger broke at exactly 3.5 pounds of pressure. He knew this rifle better than its original owner ever had, because necessity had made him a student, where training had made others merely competent. Through his scope, he watched the Panzer's gunner traverse his main weapon, the long barrel of the 75mm gun, sweeping across the Soviet positions like a steel finger pointing death. That gun could destroy anything the Red Army possessed at normal combat ranges. Its high-velocity rounds could punch through the thickest Soviet armor as if it were paper. But its crew had never faced a threat like this. A single rifleman with impossible reach and nothing left to lose. The tank's driver maintained steady speed, following a predictable path along the ridge. This was their mistake, Dmitri realized. Routine had made them careless. They felt secure in their steel fortress, protected by distance and firepower from the desperate infantry below. They had forgotten that war rewards the unexpected, that innovation born of desperation could reach across impossible distances to touch the untouchable. Behind him, Dmitri could hear his comrades whispering among themselves. Some placed quiet bets on whether he would actually fire. Others debated the physics of what he claimed he could do. A few simply watched in silence, perhaps understanding that they were witnessing something unprecedented, a moment when the mathematics of war would be rewritten by a man with steady hands and salvaged glass. Sergeant Petrov crouched nearby, his weathered face showing reluctant interest despite his earlier skepticism. The old soldier had seen enough combat to recognize skill when it appeared, even in forms he didn't understand. He watched Dmitri's preparations with the eye of a man who had survived by recognizing which desperate gambles might actually succeed. The political officer, Kozlov, observed from a distance with the careful neutrality of someone who knew this moment would require explanation regardless of its outcome. If Dmitri succeeded, he would need to report how an unauthorized modification had achieved impossible results. If he failed, he would need to explain why he had allowed the experiment to proceed. Either way, forms would need to be filled out in triplicate. But Burat, meaning Gracie, seamless now, reduced to insignificance by the purity of the moment. Through his improvised scope, Dmitri could see the German commander's face clearly as the man swept his own binoculars across the Soviet positions. He was young, probably not much older than Dmitri himself. His uniform was clean and well-tailored, his equipment maintained to the highest standards. He represented everything the Reich claimed to embody: order, efficiency, technological superiority. Yet that superiority had made him predictable. German doctrine relied on overwhelming force applied according to established principles. Their training manuals covered every contingency that rational military minds could imagine. What they hadn't planned for was irrationality elevated to art, desperation refined to precision, and the impossible shot fired by a man who refused to accept that impossible meant impossible. The crosshairs of Dmitri's scope settled on the narrow vision port where the commander's face appeared periodically. At this range, the target area was smaller than a playing card. The slightest error in calculation, the tiniest tremor in his hands, and the bullet would miss by meters. But optical precision had taught him that perfection was achieved through the accumulation of tiny corrections, each adjustment bringing the system closer to ideal performance. His finger took up the slack in the trigger, feeling the mechanism's precise breakpoint. The rifle had been designed for this moment, crafted by German engineers who understood that war demanded perfection from its tools. They had created a weapon capable of impossible accuracy in the hands of someone skilled enough to use it. They simply hadn't expected that someone to be a Soviet optical apprentice with a handful of salvage parts and a refusal to accept defeat. The wind held steady, carrying the scent of winter across the battlefield. Through his scope, the German tank seemed close enough to touch, despite the nearly 2 kilometers that separated them. The commander's face appeared again in the vision slit, clear and sharp through the cracked lens that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. Dmitri's world contracted to the size of that tiny target. The war, the cold, the fear, all of it faded until nothing remained except the mathematical relationship between his rifle and that distant point of vulnerability. His breathing slowed to nothing. His heartbeat steadied to a rhythm as regular as a metronome. The trigger beneath his finger became the fulcrum on which the entire war would balance. The German tank rolled forward, its crew unaware that their routine patrol had become the subject of the most ambitious shot ever attempted on the Eastern Front. Inside their steel fortress, they felt secure, protected by distance and armor from the desperate Soviet infantry huddled in the ruins below. They had no way of knowing that desperation had found a way to reach them, that innovation born of necessity was about to rewrite the rules of engagement with a single, impossible bullet. Through his improvised scope, Dmitri Volkov took aim at history itself, his finger steady on the trigger that would either make him a legend or confirm his status as another forgotten casualty of a war that consumed everything it touched. The morning air held its breath, waiting for the crack of the rifle that would announce whether genius or madness had guided his hand in creating the weapon that shouldn't have existed, but somehow, impossibly, did. The moment stretched like a taut wire. Dmitri's finger rested on the trigger with the delicate touch of a watchmaker adjusting a mainspring. Through his salvage scope, the German commander's face filled the crosshairs, unaware that death was calculating his trajectory from nearly 2,000 meters away. The young Soviet had become something more than a soldier in that instant. He was mathematics made flesh, physics given human form. The rifle bucked against his shoulder with authority violent. The crack of the gunshot rolled across the frozen battlefield like thunder, echoing off the ruins of factories and shattered buildings. For a heartbeat, the world seemed suspended in amber. Then came the impact. Through his scope, Dmitri watched the impossible become reality. The bullet, travelling for what felt like an eternity, found its mark with surgical precision. The German commander's head snapped back. His binoculars tumbled from nerveless fingers. The mighty Panzer IV, its brain suddenly severed, lurched to a grinding halt. Behind Dmitri, absolute silence reigned. Not the tense quiet of men holding their breath, but the stillness of witnesses to a miracle. Sergeant Petrov's weathered face had gone pale. The soldiers who had mocked the young optical apprentice now stared at him with something approaching religious awe. Even Lieutenant Kozlov, the political officer who had seen everything the war could offer, stood frozen in disbelief. The German tank crew inside the Panzer reacted with confused panic. Their commander had simply vanished, his voice cut off mid-sentence over the intercom. The gunner tried to raise him on the internal communication system, receiving only static. The driver, feeling the tank's sudden stop, called out questions that went unanswered. They had no context for what had happened. No training manual that explained how their invincible fortress could be penetrated by an invisible enemy from an impossible distance. Through his scope, Dmitri watched the chaos unfold inside the steel coffin. The surviving crew members were arguing, gesturing wildly, pointing in different directions as they tried to understand the source of the attack. They scanned the immediate terrain through their vision ports, searching for enemy positions within normal rifle range. It never occurred to them to look nearly 2 kilometers away, where a young man with steady hands and salvaged glass had just rewritten the mathematics of warfare. The implications began to ripple outward like stones thrown into still water. Word spread through the Soviet defensive line with the speed of wildfire. Volkov hit the tank from 2,000 meters, through the commander's vision slit with his makeshift scope. Each telling added new details, new impossibilities that somehow had become fact. Soldiers abandoned their positions to see the weapon that had achieved the unthinkable. But Dmitri barely heard the commotion behind him. He was already working the bolt, ejecting the spent cartridge case and chambering a fresh round. Through his scope, he could see movement inside the dismantled Panzer. The surviving crew members were attempting to continue their mission, but without their commander, they were operating blind. The tank's main gun traversed uncertain for targets its searching crew couldn't identify. The second shot came 90 seconds after the first. This time, Dmitri aimed for the gunner's position, another impossibly small target made visible through his improvised optics. The bullet punched through the vision port with the same devastating precision, silencing the 75mm cannon forever. Inside the tank, panic gave way to terror as another crew member simply ceased to exist, struck down by an enemy they couldn't see or comprehend. The driver, now alone in his steel tomb, made the only rational decision available to him. The Panzer's engine roared to life as he threw the transmission into reverse, backing away from the ridge at maximum speed. Smoke poured from the exhaust as the powerful engine strained against the tank's weight. But retreat offered no salvation from an enemy who could reach across impossible distances with surgical accuracy. Dmitri's third shot found the driver's vision block just as the tank crested a small hill in its desperate flight. The Panzer IV, now truly lifeless, rolled backward down the slope until it crashed into a shell crater, its engine finally falling silent. In the span of 4 minutes, a single Soviet rifleman with a handful of salvage parts had destroyed one of Germany's most advanced fighting vehicles without leaving his position or firing more than 3 rounds. The silence that followed was different from the stunned quiet after the first shot. This was the hush of men confronting a fundamental shift in their understanding of warfare itself. The rules had changed. Distance was no longer protection. Superior technology could be defeated by desperate innovation. A single skilled marksman with an improvised weapon could neutralize targets that entire battalions couldn't touch. Sergeant Petrov was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "How did you know it would work? He asked, approaching Dmitri's position with the careful steps of a man walking on sacred ground. The young optical apprentice looked up from his rifle, his face showing not triumph, but the hollow exhaustion of someone who had just crossed a line he couldn't uncross. "I didn't know," Dmitri replied quietly, his hands still trembling from the recoil and adrenaline. "I believed. There's a difference." He looked back through his scope at the smoking wreckage of the German tank, its grey hull now a monument to the power of refusing to accept limitations. My grandfather told me that every target is within range if you're willing to learn what range really means. March 15th, 1945. The morning mist clung to the German countryside like smoke from a dying fire. Somewhere east of the Rhine, a single American tank destroyer crouched behind a grove of shattered oak trees. The metal beast was scarred from weeks of combat, its olive-drab paint chipped and faded. Inside, Staff Sergeant Michael Torres wiped condensation from his periscope and squinted into the grey dawn. His breath came in short puffs. The air inside the cramped fighting compartment was thick with the smell of gun oil and cold sweat. Behind him, his loader fumbled with armour-piercing shells, fingers stiff from the bitter March cold. The radio crackled with static and distant voices, but no clear orders came through. They were alone, cut off from their battalion for nearly 6 hours. No communication, no backup, no idea where the front line actually was anymore. But Torres could see something his commanders could not. Through the morning haze, a column of German armour was moving down the valley road. 12 vehicles, maybe more, Panzer IVs mostly, with at least 2 Tigers leading the formation. They moved with the confidence of hunters, not the desperation of prey. These weren't retreating Germans. These were elite units, fresh and dangerous, pushing toward what Torres suspected was a vital crossroads just 2 miles behind his position. According to every manual he'd ever read, the correct procedure was clear. Observe, report, wait for orders. Do not engage without authorization. Do not reveal your position unless directly threatened. But the radio was dead. His battalion was gone, and those tanks were heading straight for a supply depot that held enough fuel and ammunition to keep an entire American division moving for a week. Torres had no orders, no permission to fire, no backup coming, just a decision to make and maybe 30 seconds to make it. He could sit silent and watch the enemy roll past, or he could do something that would either save American lives or get him court-martialed. Both. What possibly no was that his next decision would rewrite the tactical manual on tank destroyer operations, and it would all begin with a single shot that was never supposed to be fired. The gunner who wasn't supposed to be there, Michael Torres, was not born to be a soldier. He grew up in the dusty border town of Laredo, Texas, where the Rio Grande carved a lazy line between 2 worlds. His father ran a small auto repair shop that specialized in fixing broken-down trucks and farm equipment. His mother taught 3rd grade at the local Catholic school. Michael learned to work with his hands before he could properly tie his shoes. By age 12, he could strip down a carburetor and rebuild it from memory. He understood how machines moved, how pressure built, how metal responded to heat and stress. When the war came in 1941, Michael didn't rush to enlist. He wasn't driven by patriotic fervour or dreams of glory. He simply believed that if America was going to fight, it needed who understood people how things worked. He joined the army in early 1943, requesting assignment to the armoured forces, not because he wanted to drive tanks, but because he respected their mechanical precision. During training at Fort Hood, instructors noticed something unusual about Torres. He didn't just learn gunnery procedures, he absorbed them. He studied ballistics charts like other men read newspapers. He could calculate range and windage in his head faster than most men could use a slide rule. But more importantly, he understood timing. The split-second decisions that meant the difference between a kill and a miss, between survival and destruction. By the time he shipped out to Europe in late 1944, Torres had earned a reputation as one of the best gunners in his battalion. Quiet, methodical, deadly accurate. His crew trusted. Hissed him completely, officers respected his skill but worried about his independence. Torres had a habit of questioning orders that didn't make tactical sense. Not openly, not rebelliously, but with the persistence of a man who'd spent his life fixing things that were broken. In the hedgerows of Normandy, that persistence served him well. He learned to read the landscape like a map, to spot enemy positions by the angle of shadows, to time his shots between heartbeats. He destroyed 7 German tanks in his first month of combat. By Christmas of 1944, that number had climbed to 15. But numbers only told part of the story. Torres had developed something more valuable than accuracy. He developed intuition, the ability to sense what the enemy would do before they did it, to read the rhythm of a battle and find the moment when a single shot could change everything. His fellow soldiers called it luck. His officers called it exceptional marksmanship. Torres knew it was something else entirely. It was understanding. Understanding that war wasn't just about following orders or hitting targets. It was about recognizing the moment when the manual stopped working and instinct had to take over. That moment was coming fast. The impossible formation. Through the morning mist, the German column moved like a steel serpent across the valley floor. Torres adjusted his periscope and counted vehicles again. 12 confirmed, possibly 14. The formation was textbook perfect. 2 Tiger tanks at the front, their massive guns sweeping left and right as they advanced. Behind them, 8 Panzer IV medium tanks in tight formation, their crews alert and professional. At the rear, supply trucks and what looked like a self-propelled gun, its barrel pointed skyward against potential air attack. This wasn't a retreat, this was a spearhead. The Germans were making one final push toward the Allied supply lines, and they were doing it with precision and confidence. Torres studied their movement pattern. They advanced in bounds, one group covering while another moved forward. Professional, disciplined, dangerous. These weren't the desperate conscripts and old men he'd been fighting for weeks. These were elite troops, probably SS or regular army veterans transferred from the Eastern Front. They knew their business. But Torres noticed something else. The road they were following was narrow, hemmed in by steep banks on both sides. Dense woods to the north, a deep ravine to the south. Perfect defensive terrain if you were waiting in ambush. Terrible ground if you were caught in the open. The German commander had chosen speed over caution, betting that American forces were too scattered and disorganized to mount effective resistance. In most cases, he would have been right. But he hadn't counted on one American tank destroyer positioned perfectly to exploit the one weakness in an otherwise flawless formation. Torres wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cold. His loader, Private Danny Kowalski from Detroit, crouched beside the ammunition rack, a high-explosive shell ready in his arms. The driver, Corporal Jimmy Martinez from El Paso, sat motionless at controls, engine idling quietly. They all understood the situation without speaking. One shot would announce the entire their presence to German column. One shot would bring down return fire from a dozen guns. One shot would either stop a major enemy advance or get them all killed. Torres placed his hand on the gun's elevation wheel. Through his sight, he could see individual German tank commanders standing in their turret hatches, scanning the terrain ahead. They looked confident, almost casual. They had no idea death was watching them through a telescopic sight, calculating range and deflection, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The first Tiger was now 800 yards away, well within range of the tank destroyer's powerful gun. But Torres didn't aim at the Tiger. Instead, he traversed slightly right, settling his crosshairs on the third vehicle in the column. A Panzer IV carrying what looked like additional fuel barrels strapped to its rear deck. Not the most dangerous target, but potentially the most valuable, because Torres understood something about armoured formations that most gunners never learned. Sometimes the best way to stop a column isn't to kill the lead vehicle. Sometimes it's to create chaos in the middle, to turn order into confusion, to make the enemy's strength work against them. His finger found the trigger. The German tanks rolled closer, their commanders still confident, still unaware. Torres held his breath and made his choice. The shot that changed everything. Torres didn't fire at the closest target. He didn't aim for the biggest threat. Instead, he did something that would have earned him a failing grade in gunnery school. He targeted the third in the column, ad vehicle Panzer IV medium tank positioned perfectly to create maximum disruption. His reasoning was surgical in its precision. The lead Tigers were heavily armoured and alert. A shot at them might bounce off or only cause minor damage. But the Panzer IV carried extra fuel drums on its rear deck, clearly visible through his scope. One well-placed armor-piercing round would not only destroy the tank but create a fireball that would blind and confuse the entire formation. More importantly, it would block the narrow road and trap the vehicles behind it. Torres made his final adjustments. Range 750 yards, wind negligible. Target moving at approximately 15 miles per hour from left to right. He led the target slightly, accounting for the time it would take the shell to travel the distance. His crosshairs settled on the junction between the tank's turret and hull, right where the fuel drums were mounted. He squeezed the trigger. The tank destroyer rocked backward from the massive coil. Gun belched flame-piercing shell and smoke. The armor screamed across the valley at nearly 3,000 feet per second. Time seemed suspended. Then the Panzer IV simply vanished in a column of fire and black smoke. The external fuel drums detonated in a chain reaction that sent burning gasoline cascading across the road like napalm. The tank's ammunition cooked off seconds later, launching the turret 30 feet into the air in a spectacular fountain of sparks and twisted metal. The explosion was so violent it knocked the German tank commander in front of it to his knees. But Torres wasn't finished. While his loader rammed another shell into the breach, Torres traversed left and acquired a new target. The supply truck at the rear of the column, now clearly visible as its crew tried to reverse away from the burning wreckage ahead. His second shot struck the truck's cargo bed, which erupted in a secondary explosion that suggested it had been carrying ammunition or fuel. Burning debris rained down on the German formation like hellfire. Within 60 seconds, the disciplined advance had turned into chaos. The lead Tigers tried to push forward but found their path blocked by burning wreckage. The tanks behind them couldn't reverse because of the destroyed supply truck. They were trapped in a narrow corridor with nowhere to go and no clear idea where the American fire was coming from. German commanders began shouting orders over their radios. Some crews abandoned their vehicles and took cover in the roadside ditches. Others tried to return fire, but they were shooting blind, their muzzle flashes revealing their positions without hitting anything meaningful. Torres had achieved something remarkable. With 2 shots, he had turned a perfectly executed German advance into a disorganized rout. But the battle was far from over. The surviving German tanks were beginning to recover from their initial shock, and Torres knew that once they identified his position, they would concentrate their fire on his lone tank destroyer. He had perhaps 2 minutes before the return fire began in earnest. Time enough for maybe 3 more shots if his crew moved fast and stayed calm. And Torres intended to make every shot count. The deadly game of cat and mouse. The German response was swift and brutal. Within minutes of Torres's second shot, the surviving tanks began to move with desperate purpose. The lead Tiger rotated its massive turrets, searching for muzzle flash. Its commander, visible through Torres's periscope, was pointing frantically toward the tree line where the American tank destroyer lay hidden. But Torres had already moved, following a principle he'd learned in the Texas borderlands where rattlesnakes struck once and disappeared. He ordered his driver to reverse 20 yards into deeper cover. The engine growled softly as they repositioned behind a collapsed stone wall that had once marked some farmer's property line. From this new position, Torres could see the entire German formation through gaps in the rubble. The burning Panzer IV continued to belch black smoke, creating a perfect screen that masked his movements while silhouetting the enemy vehicles. His loader Kowalski was already feeding the 3rd shell into the breach, high explosive this time, designed to fragment and spread destruction across soft targets. Torres had spotted something the Germans probably didn't realize they'd revealed. In their panic to reorganize, several tank crews had dismounted and were taking cover behind their vehicles. A high explosive round detonating among them would eliminate experienced crews, even if it didn't destroy their tanks. Through his sight, Torres watched the lead Tiger fire blindly into the woods 300 yards from his actual position. The massive gun belched flame and the shells screamed overhead, detonating harmlessly among empty trees. The German commander was guessing, firing at shadows and hopes rather than confirmed targets. That gave Torres the advantage he needed. He shifted his aim to a cluster of German infantry who had gathered behind one of the Panzer IVs, trying to set up what looked like a portable radio. Command and control elements. Take them out and the remaining tanks would be fighting as individuals rather than as a coordinated unit. His 3rd shot struck the ground. just beside the radio team. The high-explosive shell detonated with a sharp crack, sending fragments of hot metal scything through the group. Bodies scattered, the radio equipment disintegrated, and most importantly, the tank crews who had been receiving orders suddenly found themselves cut off from their commanders. Torres allowed himself a grim smile. 3 shots, 3 hits, and the German formation was coming apart like a watch with its mainspring broken. But his satisfaction was short-lived. The second Tiger had identified the general area of his position and was traversing its gun toward his hiding spot. The massive barrel swung slowly but inexorably in his direction, and Torres knew that when it fired, the stone wall that protected him would offer about as much resistance as tissue. Paper. The hunter becomes the hunted. The Tiger's gun was now pointed directly at Torres's position. Through his periscope, he could see the German gunner making final adjustments, preparing to fire. The massive 88mm cannon could punch through the front armor of most American tanks at this range. Against a tank destroyer hidden behind a stone wall, it would be like using a sledgehammer on an egg. Torres had perhaps 10 seconds before that gun fired. Not enough time to move to a new position, not enough time to acquire and engage a new target, but maybe enough time to do something completely unexpected. Instead of trying to escape or return fire, Torres ordered his driver to do the one thing no tank destroyer was ever supposed to do in this situation. He told him to charge. The M10 Wolverine lurch, edged forward, crashing through the stone wall in an explosion of dust and rubble. Chunks set off the masonry-bound hull as the vehicle emerged from cover and accelerated directly toward the German formation. The maneuver was so audacious, so contrary to every principle of tank destroyer tactics, that it caught the Germans completely off guard. The Tiger commander, who had been preparing to fire at a stationary target hidden behind cover, suddenly found himself trying to track a moving target closing the distance at 30 miles per hour. His gunner, thrown off by the unexpected movement, fired high and wide. The shell screamed over Torres's head and detonated somewhere in the woods behind him. But Torres wasn't charging blindly. As his tank destroyer raced across the open ground, he was calculating angles and distances with the precision of a pool player lining up a bank shot. He had identified a new target, one that would maximize the chaos he'd already created. A fuel truck that had been hidden behind the lead Tiger, invisible from his previous position but now clearly exposed as he changed angles. His fourth shot, fired on the move at a range of less than 400 yards, struck the fuel truck dead center. The explosion was magnificent and terrible. Thousands of gallons of gasoline erupted in a fireball that rose 200 feet into the air and spread burning fuel across 50 yards of roadway. The heat was so intense that Torres could feel it through his tank destroyer's armor plating. More importantly, the explosion caught 2 more Panzer IVs in its radius. One burst into flames immediately. The other, its paint scorched black and its crew probably blinded by the flash, began moving erratically, like a wounded animal. The German formation was no longer a formation at all. It had become a collection of individual vehicles, some burning, some damaged, all of them confused and desperate. But Torres knew his luck couldn't hold forever. His aggressive charge had closed the distance between him and the enemy, but it had also exposed him to fire from multiple directions. The surviving Tiger was already traversing its turret to track his movement. A Panzer IV that had escaped the worst of the fuel truck explosion was also bringing its gun to bear. And somewhere in the smoke and chaos, other German guns were searching for him. The impossible escape. Torres found himself in the most dangerous position a tank destroyer could occupy. Close range, multiple enemies, limited cover. The Wolverine had been designed to fight from concealment, using its powerful gun to engage enemy armor at long distance before disappearing into the landscape. Now he was trapped in a point-blank slugging match with vehicles that outgunned and out-armored him. The second Tiger fired first. Torres felt the shockwave as the 88mm shell passed close enough to his turret to scrape paint. The round struck the ground behind him and exploded, showering his vehicle with dirt and stone fragments. His driver, Martinez, was already turning hard left, trying to throw off the aim of the other German gunners. But turning also meant exposing the thin side armour of the tank destroyer to enemy fire, a calculated risk that might buy them a few more seconds of life. Torres traversed his gun right, searching for targets through the smoke and flame. The fuel truck was still burning, sending up a pillar of black smoke that provided some concealment. But the fire was also illuminating his tank destroyer, making it visible to every German gunner in the area. He needed to end this quickly before weight of numbers overwhelmed him. Through a gap in the smoke, he spotted his next target. Not a tank, but something potentially more valuable. A German command vehicle, a half-track with multiple radio antennas, had been positioned behind the main formation to coordinate the advance. Its crew was probably trying to call for reinforcements or artillery support. Either option would be disastrous for Torres and any other American forces in the area. His fifth shot was fired at maximum depression. The gun angled downward to strike the half-track's thin top armour. The armour-piercing shell punched through the vehicle's roof and detonated inside the passenger compartment. Radio equipment sparked and died. Maps caught fire. And most importantly, the German unit's ability to communicate with higher headquarters died with the vehicle. But even as Torres registered the hit, he saw the muzzle flash of the surviving Tiger. This time, the German gunner's aim was true. The 88mm shell struck the front slope of Torres's tank destroyer with a sound like the world's largest bell being struck by a hammer. The impact threw him against the gun sight hard enough to split his lip. Smoke and sparks filled the fighting compartment. For a moment, Torres thought they were finished, but the shell had struck at an angle, deflecting off the sloped armour instead of penetrating. The tank destroyer was damaged, but still functional, still dangerous. Martinez had kept the engine running throughout the engagement, and now he proved his worth by executing a maneuver that saved all their lives. Instead of trying to retreat, he accelerated directly toward the Tiger that had just fired at them. The German crew, expecting their target to withdraw or return fire, was caught completely unprepared for a damaged American tank destroyer to charge their position like a medieval knight. Torres realized what his driver was doing and adjusted his tactics accordingly. As they closed to point-blank range, he depressed his gun and fired directly into the Tiger's track assembly. The shot severed the massive tank's left track, immobilizing it instantly. The Tiger could still rotate its turret and fire, but it could no longer maneuver. And in armoured combat, a tank that couldn't move was already half dead. The wounded Tiger tried to bring its main gun to bear, but Torres was inside its minimum engagement range. The massive tank's turret rotated desperately, trying to track the American vehicle that was now circling it like a wolf around a wounded buffalo. But the 88mm cannon couldn't depress far enough to hit a target so close to the hull. Torres ordered Martinez to maintain their circular movement while he searched for the killing shot. The Tiger's commander, visible in his cupola, was shouting orders and pointing frantically. Other German tank crews were trying to maneuver for clear shots, but the burning wreckage and thick smoke made it nearly impossible to distinguish friend from foe. Through his periscope, Torres spotted what he was looking for: a gap in the Tiger's side armour where the drive sprocket housing met the main hull. It was a small target, maybe 8 inches wide, but at this range even a small target was manageable. His sixth shot punched through the weak point and into the Tiger's engine compartment. The massive tank shuddered, coughed black smoke, and fell silent. But the victory was costly. The constant manoeuvring and the shock from the German hit had damaged something in the Wolverine's transmission. Martinez reported that they were losing power, the engine beginning to overheat. They had maybe 10 minutes of mobility left before the tank destroyer would be immobilized and helpless. Torres made a quick tactical assessment. Of the original 12 German vehicles, ATD or burning least 7 were destroyed. 3 more were damaged and out of action. That left perhaps 2 functional tanks and whatever infantry had survived the fuel truck explosion. Not enough to continue the original mission, but more than enough to finish off 1 crippled American tank destroyer if they coordinated their attack properly. The smoke from the burning vehicles was beginning to dissipate, which would eliminate Torres's concealment within minutes. He could try to withdraw, hoping to reach friendly lines before his transmission failed completely. Or he could press his attack while he still had the element of surprise, trying to eliminate the remaining German resistance before they could reorganize. Torres chose aggression. Through the clearing smoke, he had spotted one final target that would ensure the German column could never complete its mission. A second fuel truck, hidden behind the wreckage of the first Tiger, was trying to reverse down the narrow road. If it escaped, it might reach other German units and provide the fuel they needed to continue their advance toward Allied supply lines. Martinez coaxed their dying tank destroyer forward, the engine coughing and sputtering with each yard gained. Torres traversed left, tracking the retreating fuel truck through his damaged sight. The crosshairs were cracked, making precise aiming difficult, but at this range, precision was less important than timing. His seventh and final shot caught the fuel truck just as it reached the bend in the road. The explosion was smaller than the previous fuel fires, but no less decisive. Burning gasoline spread across the roadway, creating an impassable barrier that would prevent any German reinforcements from using this route for hours. Then the Wolverine's engine seized with a grinding screech of tortured metal. They were dead in the water, surrounded by burning German vehicles, and with no way to escape if enemy reinforcements arrived. But Torres felt a strange calm settle over him as he surveyed the destruction they had wrought. The narrow valley road was now completely blocked by burning wreckage. 7 German tanks destroyed, 2 more damaged beyond repair, supply vehicles eliminated, command and control disrupted. What had begun as a perfectly executed enemy advance had been turned into a graveyard of twisted steel and smoke. But more importantly, Torres realized he could hear something in the distance that changed everything. The rumble of approaching engines, but not German engines. These were American. The distinctive sound of Sherman tanks and half-tracks moving cross-country at speed. His battalion had finally found him. The first Sherman crested the ridge behind his position 20 minutes later, its commander standing in the turret hatch and staring in amazement at the destruction spread across the valley floor. Behind it came more tanks, tank destroyers, and infantry carriers, an entire armoured task force that had been searching for the missing German column. Torres climbed out of his disabled Wolverine and walked toward the lead Sherman, his legs unsteady from adrenaline and exhaustion. The tank commander, a major he didn't recognise, dismounted and approached him with an expression of disbelief. "Sergeant, did you do all this?" Torres nodded, suddenly aware of how the scene must look to fresh eyes. 12 German vehicles destroyed or disabled by what appeared to be a single American tank destroyer. It was the kind of tactical success that would normally require a full company of tanks supported by artillery and airstrikes. "We got cut off from the battalion," Torres explained simply. "Radio was dead." I could see they were heading for the supply depot, so I engaged. The major walked among the burning wrecks, counting vehicles and shaking his head. When he returned, his expression had shifted from disbelief to something approaching awe. "Sergeant, do you realize what you've accomplished here? This was Kampfgruppe Steiner, one of the last effective German armoured units in this sector. Intelligence has been tracking them for weeks, trying to predict their next move. You've just eliminated an entire enemy task force with a single tank destroyer." Torres looked back at his disabled Wolverine, smoke still rising from its engine compartment. "Just did what needed doing, sir. Couldn't let them reach the depot." But even as he spoke those words, Torres understood that something significant had occurred here. Not just a tactical victory, but a demonstration of how individual initiative and tactical flexibility could overcome superior numbers and firepower. The German column had been larger, better equipped and professionally led, but they had been operating according to rigid doctrine, following predetermined routes and procedures. Torres had improvised, adapted and overcome through a combination of technical skill and tactical audacity that no manual could teach. He had violated every principle of tank destroyer employment and achieved results that a full battalion might have struggled to accomplish through conventional means. The Major was already calling for recovery vehicles and casualty collection teams. There would be reports to file, investigations to conduct, lessons to be learned and disseminated throughout the armoured force. But Torres knew that the most important lesson couldn't be written in any manual. Sometimes the difference between victory and defeat came down to one soldier's willingness to act when action seemed impossible, to fight when fighting seemed hopeless, to make the hard choice when all the easy options had been eliminated. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres never received a medal for what happened in that valley. The official report listed it as a successful defensive engagement against enemy armour, filed away with thousands of other combat actions from the closing months of the war. But word spread among the tank destroyer crews. They called it the Torres method, a new way of thinking about armoured combat that emphasised aggression over caution, initiative over doctrine. Torres himself returned to Laredo after the war, opened a small garage and rarely spoke of that March morning when he rewrote the rules of engagement with 7 well-placed shots. He had proven something that would echo through military academies for decades. Sometimes the most effective weapon isn't the biggest gun or the thickest armour, but the willingness to act when everyone else hesitates. In war, as in life, victory often belongs not to those who follow the manual, but to those who understand when to throw it away.